Hey guys, it's me, Mr. Farrader. Let's talk for a second or two about the plants and animals that you'll find in the ocean. I'm sure it doesn't surprise you to find out that there's lots of plants and animals in the ocean, right? That shouldn't be surprising given the size of the ocean as an ecosystem. So one of the things that oceanographers do while they study the oceans is they divide the oceans into zones that are based on how deep does sunlight actually penetrate. As you know, plants need sunlight most of the time in order to be able to survive, thrive, and reproduce. And so the ocean zones really and truly look differently depending on how much sunlight penetrates each individual ocean zone. The only place that you're going to find any plants in the ocean are in those zones where sunlight can penetrate the ocean's waters. I'm sure that makes sense to you, right? Like if plants depend on sunlight for photosynthesis, the deeper you go, the less photosynthesis is going to be possible, simply because there's less sunlight available. I think that matters. However, even though plant life only exists in the parts of the ocean that sunlight can penetrate, all life in the ocean is in the end dependent upon plants. Remember that just like you and I are dependent on plants for food sources, organisms in the ocean are dependent on plants as food sources too. Also, just like you and I are dependent on plants on land for absorbing carbon dioxide and trapping it, so are organisms in the ocean. They're dependent on plants to do the same thing. And then last but not least, just like you and I are dependent upon plants and on land to put oxygen back into the atmosphere for us, organisms in the ocean are depending on plants to do those same things. So plants actually play a really important role in the oceans, and they play similar roles to the roles that they would have played here on Earth. Now, let me introduce you to one of the most important plants in the entire ocean. You're looking at it there on the screen. Does it look like any of the plants that you see on the surface of the Earth? The answer is probably no, or at least on the terrestrial part of the Earth. The answer is probably no, right? You don't see plants that look like that terribly often. We call that plant that you're looking at phytoplankton. And it's a form of algae. And it may not look terribly important to you, but it is hugely important to both you and to the oceans. So one of the things that phytoplankton does is it is able to grow by producing its own energy through photosynthesis. So it's actually absorbing sunlight from the sky just like a regular plant. It's absorbing nutrients from the seawater just like a regular plant would absorb nutrients from the soil. And it uses those two things in order to be able to grow. And now, once phytoplankton is able to grow, it does tons of things for both us and the ocean. I want to show you some of those on this particular graphic. So phytoplankton, just like plants on the terrestrial part of Earth, are absorbing carbon dioxide from their atmosphere. So you can see that here in the graphic. They have to absorb carbon dioxide in order to perform photosynthesis, just like a plant on the terrestrial portion of Earth has to absorb carbon dioxide in order to do photosynthesis. So right there is an important impact that phytoplankton have on you and me. They're actually absorbing carbon dioxide from the air for us. And if you know anything about global warming, the amount of carbon that's in our atmosphere is of concern to scientists. So the fact that phytoplankton is absorbing some of that carbon dioxide for us is actually a win. Now, phytoplankton also become the primary food source for these critters, which are called zooplankton. So these are animals, little teeny tiny animals, and they eat the phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton is like the producer in the food chain, and the zooplankton are like the primary consumer in the food chain. Now, why should we care about zooplankton, something you've probably never heard of before? Well, remember, these guys are going to become an important part of other food chains, right? Like larger critters are going to start to eat those. So this is just like a food chain on Earth, isn't it? The plants are converting sunlight into energy. That energy is being passed up the food chain to increasingly larger animals. So there's another reason why phytoplankton matter to you and I. But here's something that I think is incredibly cool. When phytoplankton die, they tend to sink to the bottom of the ocean. And you might say to yourself, well, who cares where phytoplankton goes when it dies? Well, you should really care about where phytoplankton goes when it dies, because don't forget what that phytoplankton originally did. It absorbed carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. So when it dies and sinks to the bottom of the ocean, that carbon that it absorbed is now trapped at the bottom of the ocean. And that's a good thing for you and I. Carbon is only dangerous to humans when it exists as a gas in our atmosphere, because that's where it can hold on to heat. So any place that we can trap carbon for long periods of time actually helps us on Earth to keep our planet cool and livable. Well, phytoplankton's doing that. It's absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and whatever it doesn't pass on to larger animals gets trapped and it sinks to the bottom of the ocean when the phytoplankton dies. Can't tell me that's not cool. Now, I mentioned just a moment ago that there are lots of food chains in the ocean and that phytoplankton are generally at the bottom of that food chain. Well, here's just a graphic so that you can see what that looks like in action. The phytoplankton are the producers. They're taking sunlight and carbon dioxide and converting it into usable energy. Zooplankton are smaller animals that consume the phytoplankton. They're your primary consumers. And then as you move up the chain into secondary consumers, you can see that those are different sized fish. But remember where all the energy began. It began down here at phytoplankton. So those food chains don't look all that different than food chains that are on the terrestrial portion of Earth, right? We shouldn't be surprised at the fact that there are food chains in the ocean. Well, just like we shouldn't be surprised that there are food chains in the ocean, we also shouldn't be surprised that there are lots of overlapping food chains in the ocean as well. Do you remember what those are called in science terms when you have lots of overlapping food chains? Right, the answer is those are food webs. And we should be happy that there are food webs in the ocean, just like there are food webs on the terrestrial portion of Earth, simply because it means that if one organism happens to die or go extinct, the entire ocean doesn't collapse. Most organisms belong to more than one food chain, which means that overlappingness, that mesh of animals, is unlikely to collapse simply because one organism is removed from the food chain. Now, I can't wait for you to watch in class this video that comes on the next slide about zooplankton, because they really are the primary consumers of the oceans. And they're these tiny microscopic animals, or the immature stages of larger ocean animals, and they're so fascinating. Wait till you see what they look like. I think it'll blow your mind. Now, why should we care about these little critters, which we probably haven't heard before? Well, remember, somebody has got to consume the phytoplankton in order to move the energy up the food chain, right? And that's the role that zooplankton play. By consuming phytoplankton, they're absorbing that energy and they're providing it or moving it along to higher portions of the food chain. Okay, last thought about the plants and animals that are inside the ocean. I want you to take a look at this particular graphic, because it's showing an ocean food web. Now remember, we just talked a minute ago that a food web is several overlapping food chains. Can you find at least 2 different food chains inside of this food web? And I want you to list out from primary consumer, or from producer all the way through primary and secondary consumer. So literally write out a food chain for me. And then once you have your 2 food chains, I want you to compare them to each other. How are they similar to one another and how are they different from each other?